The query function that you're most likely to use in the context of research on phonology and phonological development is the Phon's query. So in this tutorial, what we'll do is take our time to explore the options of the Phon's query in order to see what types of options that this query system can offer us. So what I've done by clicking on that little button here, the eraser, is I've reset my form so that we start with a clean slate. And what I will do is select the sessions I want to look for, which is the entire Catocia sample corpus. And here you see the interface that looks a lot like the other query interfaces, in that we have the participant filter, we have the group options and the word options, just like in the data tiers query. But in addition to that, we have a filter for aligned phones and we have a filter for settable options. So I won't go into detail of all of these filters, but that will still give you a sense of how everything works together within Phon. And the story there, the short story, is that to do those queries manually would require a lot of programming skills. And the idea behind Phon is to give the analytic power to the user without requiring the user to become a pro at computer programming. We're all linguists or psychologists or educators or speech pathologists. So most of us are not interested in having a second career in computer science to be able to do our work. And so Phon was created in many ways to achieve that goal. So the first thing I will do is to demonstrate the Phon's query is I'll look into IP target phones, and in my current query I will just be interested in looking at the behavior of a single consonant. Let's use the consonant D here. And this is one of the simplest expressions we can put in there. So what we could do is look at the behavior of D independent of any context. So we'll just run the query, and Phon will immediately tell us how many Ds we got across each session in IP target, and by default Phon will also tell us what phones D is aligned to in the IP actual. So you can see that it takes a little bit of time to do those queries, and time is dependent on the power of your computer. But you know, the very positive side of that is that if you were to do this work manually, well, the simple task that we're doing in a few seconds here would probably take you the day, if not more, and with the chance of making mistakes along the way. So the computer system here is it kind of gives us access to this new, almost ready access to all the data in the database. Here we go. Now we have the number of results. So how many times did Phon find D in settable onsets in the database? And so if we look at this session here, we have 48 results. And just like in any other query system in Phon, we can always open up the session by clicking on the relevant line, and Phon will open up the relevant session and the results navigator, and then we can have a look at all of our results here, right? Where we can see in the results navigator that in some cases D is produced as D. In this particular case, D was spirantized to Z, and in these next two cases, D was in fact deleted, so not produced by the child. So that already gives us some information, and if we're interested in moving that information in a report, then all we have to do is follow the steps of the wizard. So click on Report Composer, and in this particular example, what I will do is only produce an aggregate. I'll organize it by child's age, but I will also look at the sort settings, because my query is a phonological query. Then what I can do is use options to sort my results by IPA criteria, and also keeping results that are accurate on top of my organizations. So this is not the factory setting. So this is what Phon, this is a configuration that I did prior to this tutorial, but just so that we do it together, I will quickly remove my criteria and give you a sense of what the sheet would look like the first time you open it. So it would look like this, and what you have to do is say, well, in my results I have a column called IPA target, and I want to sort that column using the IPA sorting. And so what is the IPA sorting is, instead of sorting things using alphabetical orders and then put all of the funny characters of the IP at the bottom of that, what the sort is an organization of your data whereby all of the stop consonants will be on top, followed by the fricatives and the affricates, and then you'll have from there the nasals, the liquids and the glides and so on. So that gives you a bit more of a phonological organization to your data. And I'm doing this for the IPA target. And if you remember that, Phon also produced or included in the query the IP actual value. So I will sort the IP actual value as well, and also sort it using the IP sort. And so now I've configured my aggregate for the way I want it. I can hit on report, and now Phon will use those report criteria and organize all of the query results into this format. So 30 seconds later, we have our aggregate where all of the data are organized, so D produced as D, and we can see where are the cases in our database, D deleted, and then D produced as T, or different types of T's. And as we can see here, we're using a lot of diacritics, and sometimes it's useful to access some type of data, but in other cases this might bloat your aggregate a little bit. So in the current case, just to give you an example of that, I want to get rid of my diacritics, so I can go back to my report composer, and here I can decide to ignore the diacritics or ignore just a certain series of diacritics. So there's additional options here, but just now what we'll do is ignore all diacritics and run the report again. So we're running the report again, and here we obtain the same result without the diacritics. So every version of T is now combined within a single IP actual phone, and so that gives us a bit of a cleaner aggregate to work with. Going back to our query, one of the questions we might have here is that given the aggregate, we see we have many different behaviors for D. So sometimes we may be interested in put those behaviors into the context of the words in which they're found. So we have the word options here, and what we can do is add data to our query report by telling Phon that every time you find a result, you have to tell me where those results are from. So what we'll do here is add our results to our results, the orthographic forms that are relevant to each word. We will also add the full IPA target and IPA actual forms. And so that will enable us to put our report into a certain, or results, sorry, into a certain context. So let's run the composer, let's run the query again. Now we've changed the query criteria. And if you had clicked here on the report composer, Phon would have given you a warning that the query criteria have changed, so that you're every time guaranteed to not build a report based on a false query. And here we go. Now we have our results. So we can again have a look at our results using the results navigator. And what we find here is that Phon not only highlights the sounds that were, well, the sound D that was looked for, but also highlights all the words in which we find these sounds. So in this particular case, the consonant D. And we can move again those results in our report composer, but knowing what the reports look like, the data on orthography, IP target, and IP actual would not be displayed in the aggregate. The aggregate is only about the primary results, but what we can do here is add a section to our report that will combine these tiers. And here we don't need to list the tiers in them in here, because the tiers were already listed as part of our query, so we can pre-visualize our report. And once the processing is complete, now we get to see all cases of D and what happened to D over time in this longitudinal corpus. And now we have access to every one example that contains the Phon D within the corpus. And as a way to exemplify what we can do with our tables, in this particular case our aggregate table, what I will do is export my table to a CSV file, which will be located within a folder, and the folder will have the same name as my query here, so phones. So there's the wizard that enables me to set the structure of my export, and then I click on export and select the location for my export, save to folder, at which point I can open my folder and double click on my newly exported file, which in LibreOffice will give me a wizard for importation, and some details here concern the character set encoding. So this report is formatted in UTF-8, and LibreOffice is really useful that way, because it tends to recognize the file encoding automatically, something that Excel sometimes will stumble upon. And this is a comma separated file, so we need to separate our values using commas. You can see if I were to unclick that, the data would become a little bit unruly. And so once my settings are well in place and I have a nice preview of my report, then I can click OK. And then I get to see all of my data within LibreOffice, and from which I can keep doing my work. For example, using that aggregate, I could calculate an accuracy rate over time just by doing a few transforms over those results. And to complete that tutorial, I want to remind you that we have not looked at all of the options available within the Phon's query. We actually have only barely scratched the surface. One of the areas that we could explore a whole lot more concerns the Phonex language, Phon standing for phonological expressions, that enable us to further contextualize our query or our Phon's query using phonological criteria. So here what I will do is add :O to my expression, which will tell Phon to look for the sound D only in syllable onsets. If I were to use the character C, it would stand for syllable coda, but we'll stick to onsets for the time being. And the other little bit I want to mention at this moment is the syllable options, which is a series of checkboxes that you can use to further refine your query based on syllable level information. So for example, here I could say I'm interested only in D production in the context where that D is produced at the beginning of a word. So we already have syllable onset set up for D here. So we can activate the search by syllable, and for words that have only one syllable, then obviously we want to look at these words because the D in onset will be word initial or close to be word initial. But for words of multiple syllables, then our query implies that we don't want to look at medial or final syllables. And finally, we have other options, for example, to look at different types of stressed or unstressed syllables, or to also look at different types of syllables. So I could decide, for example, that yes, I want to look at only word initial Ds, but in the context where the Ds are located in open syllables or closed syllables, and so on. So these options are there and available, again here, in order to make the query, to make relatively advanced queries accessible to the regular user.